you really knew how hard it was going to be on the backside of it, how many people would actually start a company? Because it's masochistic.
Tell us a little bit more. Like, why do you think it's a hard role?
You don't go to CEO school. You don't get a degree in CEOing. Like, you can't do that. There's nothing to prepare you for it. So you just have to learn on the job. And it's just like a fire hose thing.
What are the things that you see founders struggling with when it comes to either raising capital or pitching investors?
It's not just that you're pitching a business. You're trying to figure out how to pitch your business to a venture capitalist. I think really being aware of who your audience is and understanding what they are looking for.
What advice would you be giving them?
Do you have some unique industry expertise or unique relationships within that industry? And that all of those things have nothing to do with the actual product that you're building and the technical differentiation for that. The best way as a founder is that if they go into it thinking about not, I'm gonna tell them about how amazing my technology is. Let me tell you how awesome like what I'm gonna build is, like the mousetrap. But most investors like can't have that conversation. Tell me how you're gonna make me 10x more dollars than I give you. And like think about that as your pitch to everybody else that you say outside of this, and assume that they don't know anything about your tech.
Andrew, thanks so much for joining us today. We're super excited to have you on the podcast. You and I have known each other now for 5-6 years. It's been since I think 2021 when we sold iteratively, and you were super helpful on that journey, giving me advice, having gone through this yourself. Without further ado, man, would love for you to just do a quick intro on your background, and we'll kick it off from there.
Sure. So I'll be super quick. Recovering founder, now run a small VC firm investing in pre-seed and seed companies, but probably most well known, at least in the tech space here, for founding and being the CEO of a company called Signal Sciences. We started in 2013. We sold the company in 2020, and I left the company that bought us in 2023. So I did about a 10-year stint doing that. We went from $0 to $100 million run rate business. It was a B2B cybersecurity company, and lived a bunch of bad decisions that I made along the way and learned a lot in the process, and am trying to bring to bear those hard lessons learned to the world of investing and helping other people avoid those errors when they're doing their own.
And Andrew, I mean, like Signal Sciences, it wasn't definitely a linear journey for you. I mean, I remember one of the first conversations you and I had working at the Clinton Foundation, talking about that experience, kind of living and operating in Africa. What kind of set you on the path to become a founder?
So I went to Stanford undergrad, and I think a lot of people go there and there's sort of this assumption in the culture there, which is like you're ordained to become an entrepreneur when you're there. And there's great resources, and there's just incredibly talented people that are there. And I remember I took my first job out of Google, or sorry, out of Stanford, and I went to Google. And within my first like 3 months, I was like, thank God I didn't start a company, because I don't know what the hell I would have been doing. Like I was like, I don't even know how to do this tiny little, it was basically a BDR job type of thing that I was doing. And I was like, I have so much to learn just to do that. How did I ever think I was going to be able to start a company? And like, so that was, it was sort of a good, I always wanted, and I started a company in high school, and it's kind of a smaller thing, but doing like a big scale company is a very different deal. And so I think I got a little scared of it right when I got out of school. And then, 5 years later, some of my peers at the point at Google had started their own company, and they were doing their own thing, or they were investing in companies and doing their thing. And I think the more that you're around communities where people are taking the leap and they're going and doing it and they're having success, like it was a really important thing to sort of make me feel like that was possible for me to do as well. And I think look, you guys know this, everybody has a different journey to getting to the point of starting a company. But I will tell you that for anybody starting a company, I think there has to be a bit of an ignorance is bliss moment, which is like, if you really knew how hard it was going to be on the backside of it, how many people would actually start a company and do this? Because it's masochistic. But if you get into it and you're just, I think you have the right motivation and you have the right team, the right people around you, like amazing things can happen. Like, and you're just, I think I lucked out ultimately with having that.
And then talk us a little bit.
I was going to ask, like, I know that I was reading about your background, Andrew, and it's this sort of like journey came with Zach and Nick and you, and they were trying to pull you in. Like, take us to that time. I know you don't have a cybersecurity background. Now you do. Now you have a lot of expertise. I can see the books in the background there. Like, how did you guys come together, and tell us how that played itself out?
So we all worked together before, which I think is is kind of a key. So we knew each other's strengths and weaknesses. We knew how to work together. We had kind of got, we had gone through um, and had kind of distinct roles of how we work together. I was running a product group. Nick was the engineering manager to the product group that I was running, and then Zane was the chief security officer that essentially was brought in to build and run the security team that we had internally at Etsy. We were all working there out of New York. And in that context, we certainly built like a social relationship, and we liked each other and stuff like outside of work. But most of our relationship was based on a professional relationship that we had actually building features and launching them together and communicating those to a community of an active community of buyers and stuff. And so I think we got to simulate what work would look like in the future. Now, I, I still kind of I've asked Nick and Zane this, like, why did you want me to come and join you? Because I don't have a background in this stuff. And I think the funnier question is actually like, there were a lot of things that were about my back. Like, I had done a sales job before I was at, my job at Google is by and large sales. And they didn't know that. They had no idea that that was my background. They didn't know I was an athlete in college and that I was super competitive. Like, I just didn't have that. Let me put it this way. That personality didn't play out well to display a lot of at Etsy. Like, and if you know more about sort of the culture of that organization, like you would understand why that's the case, but they didn't even get to see that. So I was even, as they were learning this about me, as we were founders together, I was like, guys, like, how did you think I was going to be good at this? Like before we did it. And I think it was just um, it was just a pure comfort with the fact that we had all worked on this stuff together. Like we had solved problems together before that we didn't know the answers to. And honestly, I think that was a really good background, a good test to figure out like how we were going to do this stuff together. I still look back, by the way, like I still have conversations with them now of like looking back to when we first started and we were like, we had no idea what we were doing. Like but we figured it out and we figured it out together and we supported each other through it. But yeah, I don't have a great answer for you of like why that worked. Other than the fact that like I think we both knew what we were getting into and we had a really supportive and trusting relationship between the three of us.
Yeah, and Andrew, I think one of the things that you're showing here is kind of just a lot of humility, and like you mentioned this earlier as well, right? Like it's really hard to go start a company, and ignorance is definitely bliss there. Like when did it switch for you from being kind of a beginner's mindset and to now becoming like kind of one of the leading investors in security companies out there, right? Like I would put you into an echelon of folks that are fairly well known, at least when it comes to the security investing space.
I think that there was a moment on the journey of being a CEO for me where look, the first couple of years, I was just trying to become an expert in the product area that we were building, right? And like part of that was to become an expert so that we could raise money. Part of it was to become an expert so that I could talk, meaningfully to customers. Because again, like the product wasn't my idea, like, and it wasn't my expertise area before. And so I spent a lot of time just trying to be like, hey, I want to develop expertise there. And that was not that unlike other jobs that I had taken before. I'd worked in a bunch of smaller companies and smaller organizations before. And so trying to develop expertise in your specific job, that's pretty normal. The difference with being the founder CEO is that you're not going anywhere. Like, so it's like once you learn that, and that's like intellectual, to some extent, it's like just purely intellectually interesting to be like, oh, I'm learning a new product area and a new domain, and I got to do that. And once I became an expert, then I was kind of like, okay, what's next? And I think, as a CEO and as a founder, and this isn't exactly your question, but it's worth talking about, which is your job as a CEO continually changes, which is like, what's the next thing that you need to become good at? And there's so many parts of the role that you're just not, you don't have any background in, you're not doing it. And so you're constantly having to like step up into the new version of the role and learn how to get good at it. Right. And so for me, that next step was, okay, I'm an expert on the product. Like we're running a good team. We've hired a bunch of people. I've done hiring before. I've done product development before, but I wasn't an expert in that area. The next thing was like, how do I become sort of an industry expert? And for me, it took me on, as I thought about doing that, it took me on this journey of learning again. Like I read a bunch of books that were sort of, half of them were cultural books that would just helping me understand kind of the history of cybersecurity. Half of them were like actually understanding the technical side of stuff that like I didn't know in other parts of the area, such that I felt like I got to a point where I could like, speak coherently uh, in industry contexts and on, either podcasts or, whatever marketing thing I could do about like the broader industry. And that then I think transitioned relatively well into thinking about, okay, now I want to do investing in this space and feeling like I could, both add value to the companies that we were investing in the first place, but then even evaluate them also, right? Like, and evaluate whether or not it was going to be something that we were interested in investing in or not. And so it's, I don't know, I guess the short version of this, and I tell this to founders all the time, you don't build a company overnight. You build a company one customer at a time. And like, you don't build expertise overnight. You build it one day at a time by developing more and more expertise. And I think like an interest in learning and pursuing learning and learning from others and being humble about that you're not the smartest guy in the room for as long as you can. I don't know. I don't think there's another way.
So yeah, so talk us through that journey. So you had your two co-founders lined up. You weren't an expert. What caused you to take the leap to start this company? How did they convince you?
It's a good question. It took about 4 months, is what I would say. Like 4 months of active conversation between the three of
Were you
us.
still at Etsy at the time, or were you
I-
kind of you quit and transition?
Okay, so it was a funny story here, which is I had decided to quit Etsy and I didn't have a plan for what I was doing next. And everybody assumes that, if you have a plan for what you're doing next and you're just being coy. I like legitimately didn't have a plan. I was just like, I'd been living in New York for the last 4 years. I had worked internationally and I was just kind of exhausted. I was ready to move back to the West Coast because that's where I was from. And that's all I had. Like, that was my only plan. It was like, okay, I'm sort of done with New York. I'm done with Etsy and I'm going to find something else to do. Pursuing a number of different opportunities. But the week before, this might have been the night before my last day at Etsy, I went out to dinner with Zane and then a third colleague of ours, and we just, we like had a great meal. We got hammered in New York, and like, you know, I'm 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 talking to Zane as I was leaving, and I was just like, "Hey man, this is like a really small world, and I'm sure we'll probably work together at some point. Would love to stay in touch." And he's like, "Well, funny thing about being a small world, like we should talk tomorrow after your last day because I have an idea for you." And and that led to the starting of a conversation. So no, I had formally left Etsy before we started this company, and we then spent the next 3 months for me doing research on it. They pitched me kind of on, hey, you should join up. This is our idea, and I was like, guys, like I don't know anything about this industry, so I personally had to do some research on the industry to feel like I could get up to speed and kind of understand what I was getting myself into. But then I think ultimately what it came down to was like I trusted them. Like I thought they were experts. The more research I did, I really understood that they really were experts and industry leaders. And then my big question was, how do I raise money? Because it was like the big area that I just didn't have any background in. And like
Were they like, "Hey, you should be the CEO," or was it like, how did that happen?
It's another good question. It's something that like I forced them to read this book with me, which like I'm sort of shocked that they sort of agreed to Andrew's book club, knowing what I know about them now. But we read Founder's Dilemma, which if you know the book, it's like it's pretty good. The first couple chapters kind of go through these like, team formation, company formation stuff. And like one of the exercises that it suggests to do is both like figure out your equity split up front and then figure out what your roles are up front and at least have like in-depth conversations around those because it can lead to both confusion, especially in roles if you don't define those early on, and it can lead to resentment if you don't, have some of those conversations about who should earn what, at different times. We went through sort of a series of exercises trying to figure out who should be in what role. And like, it just, me being the product manager before and, Zane being the CISO and Nick being the engineering manager, product manager kind of fits more into a CEO type of functional role. But I think we were flexible up front of just being like, hey, let's do this. Let's figure out if it works. Right. But like, I didn't have like I will not join the company unless I'm a CEO. I was like I'm not, it's not an ego about like title for me. It was just more of like I just want to make this work, right? And so yeah, and all of us were like that. And it's funny that like even like 2 years after we started though, like in hindsight, Nick and Zane were like, man, we lucked out. like sucks for you having to be the CEO, basically, right? It's like, I, the role evolves over time, but B, it's like it is legitimately a very, very hard role. Like full stop.
Just
Like,
tell us a little bit more. Like, why do you think it's a hard role? Like, why? This is something I think a lot of people do come into it with ego or other reasons and can't really rationalize. But I would say it's a hard role. Like, why was it a hard role for you?
Especially in those early years, right? Those, just getting started, they convinced you to join. Like, what was particularly hard about those early years?
so the basics for everybody of why it's a hard role. I'll tell you like why I think in general it's a hard role, but why it was hard for me. And those are two different things, I think. In general, I think it's a hard role because there's so many different things that you're sort of expected to have expertise on. And like very few jobs prepare you for the depth and the breadth of the expertise that you're expected to have. I'm supposed to be pitching this product and know the product back and forth. Like anybody I talk to should just assume I am an expert on everything in our business. And like from finance to operations to P&L planning to hiring to PR. I mean, everything. You're sort of, the face of everything. You need to be an expert on everything. And so like, there's a lot of fake it till you make it type of thing. But like, regardless of whatever background you have getting into this role, like you don't go to CEO school. You don't get a degree in CEOing. Like you can't do that. There's nothing to prepare you for it. So you just have to learn on the job. And it's just like a fire hose thing. So that's in general, I think that's hard. For me, I think the hard part for me like was like it's gonna sound whatever. It's an emotion. It was like an emotionally hard thing because I felt so much responsibility to the people that worked for me to be awesome, knowing that I was not awesome at the job, like and that I was learning. Like and every day at the beginning you're trying, one of the hardest things to do is just convincing people to come work for you. And 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 having to sort of balance a humility that's reasonable about saying, look, we have a vision and we're going to do this. And it's, we really believe that we have an opportunity here, but also being fair about the fact that I've never done this before. Like, and it's my first time doing it. Like, you're constantly having to project confidence in an area where, like, you have natural insecurity, and you should, because it's a really hard job. And so for me, like, knowing that so many people were relying on me, including my co-founders, by the way, like who recruited me and had, you know, they recruited me, they had confidence in me. I've always felt so much responsibility to try to live up to that. And until literally from the moment that I started until the moment we sold the company, I maintained that level of pressure and stress that I put on myself to show up for them and be a CEO that I would want to follow. And like, I don't know that all CEOs feel that. But that was, on top of you got to like learn all these things and do all these things and do them well, despite the fact that you don't really know how to do any of those things well at the beginning, at least. That combination made it really hard.
Totally. Yeah. Well, it's, one of the things that we do is call this the first pitch, right? And you're obviously pitching investors, you're pitching early employees to join. What did that first pitch? What was the narrative that you went to market with? How did that evolve over the first, 6 to 12 months?
This is a good story because other people ask me this of like, hey, what's your advice for raising money, as a first time CEO? And I tend to tell people like, I don't actually have good advice for you because of I don't have good advice based on my experience because I think my experience was a bit unique. My default for a lot of things in my career, and I think tech is great for this, has been if you don't know an answer to something, call someone who you think might have some experience in it and learn from them. And there's a lot of industries where like they don't share. I think like certainly certain parts of tech, people are really willing to help you, like despite not having any vested interest in being able to help you. And so I was lucky. I reached out to a couple people who I knew were investors, literally just a handful of people. I didn't know what seed funding was versus Series A versus growth. I didn't know anything about it. It was like an area that I was really just like, I'm starting from scratch here. So I called up a guy who had been a mentor of mine in my career for a little bit. His name is Michael Deering, and I just said, hey, he based in Palo Alto. Turns out he actually ran a seed fund, right? I didn't know, again, I had no idea what that meant. And I was just like, hey, Michael, like, can I bend your ear for like half an hour? I'll buy you lunch. Can you just tell me like, I just want to know how this stuff works. Like, I don't know anything about it. Right. And he was, gracious and being like, great. Yep. I'm open and come by. And so I literally went to their office. We had lunch. and over the course of, let's call it 60 minutes, I sat down and he was like, okay, cool. Like, what can I answer for you? And I was like, Michael, honestly, I don't even know where to start. Can you tell me like what does venture look like and what does investing look like? And he's like, well, look, before I do that, just tell me the story of your company. Like, what are you guys doing? Why are you doing it? Like, just tell me that. And so I, like, it's great, like very safe, I don't know, I guess safe environment to just do a pitch. And the pitch, it wasn't a pitch. It didn't feel like a pitch to me. He was just like, hey, essentially he was like, catch me up on where you're at. Right. And, and so I tell him, I was like, well, okay, look, the background is essentially we lived this problem at this company. We solved the problem in the company, and we got a pull from the community saying we want you to solve that problem also, because the lessons that you guys are trying to teach to the rest of us, we can't actually implement. Like so we feel like there's a market opportunity here that we're being told by our peers that they want what we have built and that it would solve the same problems for them that it solved for us. And he's like, look, that was over the course of like a 60-minute conversation. Obviously, there was much more depth behind it, and lots of follow-up questions and stuff that he would ask. And then at the end, he was like, "Well, here's how this works. I write you a check."
Wow. Yeah, that's not normal, by the way.
Right. And so I was just like, okay, like I get that that's how it works in theory, Michael, but like what, And he's like, no, I'm serious. Like, here's the names of 3 lawyers. Go get incorporated. Call me when you're incorporated. So like that is a very abnormal thing. And like, look, after that, we pitched like 4 more people. But I talked to another colleague of mine. His name's Tom Tungus, who's like a renowned investor at this point. He was at Redpoint for ages. Now he started his own thing. But Tom and I shared an office together at Google, and I like went to his wedding because I know his wife really well. And so I called Tom and I was like, hey man, like I've learned enough to now know that this is probably not your area, because he wasn't a cyber investor, right? Like, but I was like, I'm just starting to talk to people. We've got an offer on the table. I've talked to only 3 investors so far. Like, what do you think I should do? And he's like, don't talk to anybody else. Take the investment and move on and start building a company. And I was like, really? I was like, because every piece of advice I've gotten is like pitch at least 25 investors. And he's like, yeah, but that's when you don't have an offer. Like, you have an offer from an amazing investor. Like, go for it. So again,
Was it different for like O'Reilly? I know that they were an early investor in your first round, or was that also just like a friend of Harrison, Metal, and that's how
it wasn't actually a friend of Harrison Metal. They had never invested. So Bryce had never invested with Michael before, but I told Bryce that we had a lead investor already, and I actually told him who it was, which is, it's funny. It's sort of a no-no now, but like Bryce was like, hey, I love Michael.
What do you mean?
Like,
Don't tell who your lead investor is a no-no?
No, it's not even that he was lead, like, because Bryce could have led. Like, so it's more that like in hindsight, like I could have made them compete over the term sheet. I could have, and like I could have driven up the price and stuff. But like I think this is one of the things that we also entered in. And like I had a really great lawyer at the time. He's great still, but his name's Craig Schmitz. He works from Goodwin. And like I tell people all the time, I was like, dude, if you don't have a great lawyer in the context of when you're starting a company, like you're really missing an opportunity here. Because Craig was great at basically saying, he could tell me if Michael was great or not. Because like people always say like, oh, get a tier 1 investor. Who's a tier 1 investor? Like you don't know this as a founder, right? Like Craig was able to say like, yep, he's awesome. He has a great reputation. I've worked with him before, like all these things. And then the terms of the deal that he had offered that we had sort of talked about high level, he was like, yeah, like that's in the ballpark. Like, so I wasn't trying to, like, he was like, look, you could go and try to pitch all these other people and optimize around this stuff, but like you could also just take it and run. And so like, this is just another area where like if you find good people that can give you advice on these things, like listen to them. And with Bryce, sorry, I was connected to Bryce from another person who had raised money from Bryce before, who was a manager of mine when I was at Etsy. He put me in touch with Bryce, so it was like a friendly conversation or a friendly intro. It was meant to be a half-hour conversation, like, and it was very like, okay, we'll slot you in with everybody else. I'm sure part of some big lineup of founders he was talking to that day. And we ended up talking for an hour and a half at this specific diner right outside of his office in San Francisco. He had about 15 Diet Cokes, and we still joke about it all the time now. And at the end of that, he was like, I'm in. Like it was a similar odd oddly easy path there. And then literally with Michael and Bryce, they were both like, "Oh, we've always wanted to work together. Like, we'll make this easy. We'll split it." And they were both like amazing and awesome and gracious about it. And we did that. We just took it and ran.
So was able to raise your seed round, no deck, talk
No
to
deck.
4 or 5 investors, closed, it sounds like, fairly quickly and on terms you're happy with.
There's 2 weeks.
Sounds amazing.
It was amazing. It was very lucky though. Like it wasn't intentional. Like I think there's some people that are like, "Oh, I'm gonna go and the strategy is gonna be I'm gonna tell a story and I'm not gonna have a deck and I'm gonna play hard to get and all this stuff." And it's like, nah, I didn't do that. Like it was very authentic in the sense of like, look, we're just starting out. Like I'm just trying to learn about investing, and they're like, "Great, take this money. It's awesome."
Did you have I mean, now that you're on this other side here, given your own personal experiences, how are you advising, other founders on how to approach fundraising? Because I will tell you, and I think we both know, like that's not normal. I mean, it does happen. It still happens. Like, how are you approaching giving guidance on how to pitch and what to do? Build a deck, no deck,
I have a bit of a
story.
yeah, I have a bit of a torturous experience thinking about if I would have invested in our company, and I think the answer is like 100% no. Like I would have failed at pitching myself at that point. Um and I think if well, okay. So the real question here is like what advice do I give to other people about it now, right? And how to do it. I tell you it's changed more, and my advice and perspective on this market has changed more in the last year than in the previous 5. Such that I think what you're trying to do as a founder is it's not just that you're pitching a business, you're trying to figure out how to pitch your business to a venture capitalist. And that's very different. Uh, Sorry, there's a bunch of layers of this, but like, I think really being aware of who your audience is and understanding what they are looking for is the most effective way that I think they can pitch an investor. And the things that I didn't understand when I was raising, because I didn't have to do this because it was too easy for me, was I just told them my story. And they extrapolated a bunch in their own mind about how like this was going to be a success versus me pitching them about what they wanted. And what I think any investor in almost any stage wants is they want to have a justification about how they can make 10x their money on an investment. And I know that sounds like kind of financially driven and heartless, but I think at the core of making these decisions, you have to have conviction as an investor that you're going to be able to 10x your money on any investment you make. Now, there's lots of different ways that you can tell that and justify that and whatever as the investor. But I think the best way as a founder is that if they go into it thinking about not, I'm going to tell them about how amazing my technology is, because that typically is what the pitch is that I'll get from first time founders. Let me tell you how awesome like what I'm going to build is, like the mousetrap or whatever. And I'm like, look, I can have that conversation because I'm technical, but most investors like can't have that conversation. And so I'm like, I try to tell people every time I was like, look, this is awesome. I like it. Tell me how you're going to make me 10x more dollars than I give you. And like, think about that as your pitch to everybody else that you say outside of this and assume that they don't know anything about your tech. So sorry, that's kind of like I don't know if that's what you're looking for from a guidance perspective, but like I think really understanding your audience and what they're looking for and what question they're trying to optimize for, it's not so intuitive if you're a first-time founder to really think about it like that.
I was I'm not obviously not an expert in signal sciences, but one of the things that is interesting about the market you're going after, there were comparables. There was Imperva, there was F5, Akamai. Do you think that was like that had it's double-edged sword? One, there's comparables. They can say, hey, I know how do you go compete with them? On the other hand, it's also like pretty entrenched category. Like, did that come up in these initial conversations, or were they just like, yeah, we love you, Andrew, like we think you're gonna do great, let's go? Or like were they, like, or did that kind of come up in the Series A? At what point did that sort of tension of market, legacy players kind of come up?
It came up tangentially, but I think at least the decision for Michael and Bryce was much more people focused, and I would say that both of them are actually like, and I would say like a lot of the investors that I aspire to be like and like to learn from, like seed and pre-seed investing, like there's not a lot there, right? So like you're not doing some sort of financial breakdown of the markets. I think, market space becomes a lot more relevant at the Series A and Series B, to just understand like how big the opportunity is, again, to justify the 10x. But I think at the beginning, it's kind of like, hey, do I believe in this team, and do I think they're, that they're going to be able to make something special happen? And people pivot and stuff all the time. And I think that was much more of the decision that they put into it. The main reason and the main way that I was able to talk about these competitors in the space is to say, we tried their products while we were in-house. They didn't work. That's why we built this other thing. And so I think there was some implied understanding of how we differentiate against them. But it's not like they were asking like, okay, cool, well, how are you going to beat Akamai? Like, they didn't ask that. Like, they might have asked like what was missing, and we had a story for what was missing.
But I mean, at that point, you and your co-founding team were already kind of experts. You were subject matter
Right.
experts, right? And what
Right.
you're doing, you'd lived the problem, right? So like, and you had, in the context, a better mousetrap to actually go out to market with this, right? Like now, that's something that is compelling, I think, to an investor. But one of the things I actually want to double click on it is
Yep.
so like you were able to raise the round primarily based off their conviction in the team, right? Like they weren't analyzing necessarily market sizing. They had
But
strong conviction in you all.
but by the way, like they hadn't met either of my other founders. Like it was just a
Okay.
conversation with me, and they had made the decision like in the moment. Like, which I'm still kind of shaking my head at. But like,
Yeah,
okay, like,
that usually they at least mean one other founder,
I know, right? Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah,
Patrick.
for founders that are listening to this,
No, this is
this is not normal, by the way, But
No.
or Andrew, you're just an exceptional person. They're like, whether it's all on you. A lot of pressure.
Well, and then that leads back to that comment, right? It's like I felt, it felt pressure to my. It's actually a good point. I felt pressure to my team. I felt pressure to my co-founders, and I felt pressure on the investors. They put a great faith effort, and anyway, yeah, that's
no
You
totally.
you spent sort of 2 years, as I understand it, like kind of working on the product, and then kind of coming out. Like, how did you go about that? I mean, because that's not how a lot of founders are thinking out. Build fast, break things kind of thing mindset. Let's take it out there. If you're not uncomfortable with your product, kind of common kind of product feedback. You're not launching it fast enough. Like, tell me about that choice in the early days.
I would love to tell you that it was like some grand strategy that like was mastermind and worked out. And I will tell you that like I think it's one of the I'm not a big like look back and dissect and figure out where you did things wrong and what we could have done better type of guy. It's really hard to know if some of the issues that you actually had ended up contributing to some of the longer term success. Like it's hard to know that, but I think this is an area where I absolutely would be different in the future, which is we were Nick and Zane mostly, they're leaders in their field. They were giving talks at industry conferences and literally had a following on their on the talks that they would give at these conferences. They had a following on their social media presences to learn from them, and as a result, I think there was a lot of pride put into, we don't want to put out a product in the space that's crappy, and we want to bring a product to market for the first time that other people that we respect in the field will think is great. And it turns out it takes a long time to build something like that. And so we spent a lot of time doing that and doing product development. And look, our first like four or five customers, they were all brand name customers. Shutterstock, Airbnb. Um, so it worked. Like, but I would have rather gotten more product feedback early to make sure that we were validating our direction, and just getting traction and customers early with a lesser product from what I'd probably call like less demanding customers who didn't need the super premium experience that was better than the F5s and the Apervas on the market. Because like getting early customer traction, early customer feedback is better than waiting. So the advice I tend to give people now is like, look, it's great to get those big name customers, but A, that takes time, and B, like, well, it takes time to actually like close the deal, right? Because enterprise contracts just takes longer. But B, like their requirements are going to be much higher than they are with others. And if this thing is about a pride thing for you, like get over the pride because guess what? Whatever product you come out to market with is going to have all sorts of problems with until you have it in the hands of people that are using it that can break it and fix it. So I, it worked for us because we were able to build a bunch of versions of this product in-house at Etsy before at massive scale. I think it really worked against our competitors because the competitors didn't have that background. And so they were kind of like sifting through the dark trying to figure out how to do this without having that experience of running big products in production. And so again, like we had a lot of stuff going for us. I wish I could sit here and tell you that that was totally masterminded. Yeah, a lot of that was, I think we kind of lucked into it.
Specifically, so it took 2 years, got the product market, totally understand, advise, ship early, learn quickly with customers, and don't be necessarily as precious about some of the things there. Yeah, totally get that. It's I think I'm definitely in the other camp at the moment, trying to get over some of those hurdles myself. Um, One of the questions I had is, when did it start feeling like you had product market fit? Like, what was that signal in market for you all when you launched the product where you're like, okay, we have something here that's working, and it was time to scale the business?
I remember explicitly, like what it was, and it didn't. I wouldn't say it took 2 years. It was probably 12 months until we had something that was like in production with a bigger customer. So but it was 2 years before we had like a scaled install. But we went early on. We like weren't talking a bunch about what we were doing, but a bit like let's call it this way. A really, really big company CISO called us up and was like, "Hey, we heard you're working on interesting stuff. Will you come and show us what you're working on?" And we're like, sure, but you'll." We went and took the meeting because why not? But we were assuming that they were going to have 10 times the stuff that we had because how could this massive company not have something that they built in house that was better than us? And we went to that meeting and the response was like, we don't have this and I need this on everything that I have. And I like remember walking out of that meeting with Zane and we were like, holy shit, this could be really big. Like really, really big. Because we didn't, most of this was literally based on this, like, hey, let's like build some stuff. We were at Etsy and we had, we had some ideas about what that could mean. And it was, it was cool for us. But we weren't sitting there being like, we're the visionaries of the world and no one's ever thought about this before. And we're the only ones that have this capability. Like we totally weren't that like confident. And I think coming out of that meeting with like this massive company that was like, we really need these capabilities and we don't have them. The funny thing, they didn't turn out to ever be a customer, by the way. But it was the moment where we knew, okay, we're not missing something where somebody else has this insight and they've built all this stuff themselves. Also, this is really a gap in the market. Like, and not only is it a gap in the market, but it's something that people will demand when they see it.
You've had a lot of, you guys, raised from Series A to Series C, had great partners along the way. Did the pitch, was it very like, you lead with numbers, sometimes you lead with numbers, you lead with story. Did the numbers kind of help carry the pitch through? Obviously, the cybersecurity market, blew up, a lot of things happening in the last, 10 years as you were building Signal Sciences. Like, how did the pitch kind of evolve and change? And, was it getting harder? Was it getting, or did the numbers just speak for themselves?
We didn't have bad numbers ever, I don't think, other than like at the beginning when we had nothing other than like a team and a story, right? But like after that, like we had, even when we pitched because at that point, like there was no pre-seed, so we just did seed and A, and so an A was kind of more like a seed now, and the seed was more like a pre-seed now. But like when we pitched our A, we had a couple of paying customers, and we had a number of users and a lot of people in the pipeline. But when we pitched our A, we didn't have a deck either. Like, and I know this is crazy, like, because it's stupid, but in hindsight, it probably kind of worked out. But like, when we went out in our Series A, we were kind of doing like hey, let's test the waters with this story and just see if there's any interest from investors. And because we knew we had some kind of early traction. So it was like kind of early in our like it was before we were planning on raising because we needed the money. We didn't need the money at the time, which I think also played into our camp, I guess, for that. But we just kind of went out and we were like, hey, let's just sit down and tell our story. We just kind of want to know like what your feedback is on the business. And of course, the old adage is you go and ask for advice and they'll give you money. You go ask for money, they'll give you advice. We asked for advice and they gave us money, right? And so that worked out, but
Is
we
that
actually did
feedback
have
you
some
actually
track.
give to founders, by the way, is to approach fundraising in that specific way?
Um, there was a moment that I would say like a lot of my advice around fundraising was kind of like, look, line up a bunch of meetings, get your story together, plan to go to Silicon Valley if you're not there right now, and spend the next 3 weeks like just blitzing and talking to as many people as possible and build FOMO, and that's how you're gonna get around done. And I very actively don't give that advice anymore. The reason why I don't give that advice now is because I just don't think that's what drive like that. I think investors kind of like learn. They're like, hey, I learned this game. Like, I'm not gonna play that game. I'm looking for a long-term like relationship with people and all that stuff. And I think the way it works now is if you just have crazy, crazy, crazy traction, it doesn't matter what your story is or how your process is. It doesn't matter. Like you're gonna raise money. You just have crazy traction. If you don't, I think it's a much more relationship building game now, which is you go and you test your story, you test the feedback, you build conviction with different people, and ideally if you actually start seeing investors lean in and they are getting closer to giving you a term sheet, you can get a couple other people involved in the process. But this like, hey, go to the valley and kind of force a process on people, again, unless you just have overwhelming traction, I've seen that fall pretty flat sometimes, because the risk there is you do that, you shoot your shot with everybody you have a connection to, and then if it doesn't work out, you're not going to come back in 3 months and have a totally different, it's not like they're going to be like, okay, great, we'll get the partnership together and meet again. And like, oh, we completely changed our decision on this. If you get to the point of the partnership even looking at it in the first place and they say no, they're not going to invest in that round. I don't care if it's 6 months from now or it's 3 months from now. They won't. But partially because the partnership will probably say no, but partially because the partner that's putting it up doesn't want to look like an idiot putting up another person that they already said no to. Like, anyway, there's got to be some big compelling reason. So I think like slow playing it and doing it kind of like a couple of people at a time to try to figure out if there's resonance and if there's conviction and if there's chemistry with that person. I think it's just a much more both effective means of being able to raise and a way to reduce risk in the process.
Yeah, I feel like right now, particularly, we are in this state of like it's hard to really. No one wants to get married right away, and people want to build a relationship and kind of track you and see how it goes versus being like forced into a marriage. This being said, yeah, if you have the hot numbers, you can be in control over who you want to get married with, and there's a lot of things that you can control. But even then, like I don't recommend it. I think this is the job of the CEO outside of the other 1,000 things is that you need to do is to build relationships with capital partners.
Totally. I
And
Yeah. Go ahead,
I was
Pat.
gonna say, Andrew, I mean, you did a good job with that, right? I mean, you raised your Series A from Index and CRV, and like you did the capital efficiency, like you raised a ton of capital fairly quickly up until the acquisition. I just talked through what was your strategy there? Like why did you want to go raise, the $60 million, right? Like what was your strategy there from a deployment perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think this is still the case now when I talk to founders and I talk to them about some of the dynamics around this, which is like we got feedback from frankly, our employees were like, our round was only, I think our Series A was like a $9.8 million round, and they're
Yeah.
like, but our competitors just raised 25, like.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, yeah, but like dilution math is a thing. Like, and I honestly, like, I think employees in general like have a hard time understanding equity, and it's not because it's hard conceptually, but it's kind of a black box in most companies you go to. They don't talk about how much equity everybody owns and what the equity splits are and stuff like that. So it's understandably hard, but we tried to have like kind of a ongoing conversation about how much you raise. It's as much about how much you need and how much dilution you want to take at the time. And like, I think again, for better or for worse, my and our strategy on this stuff was like, I think I'm betting on ourselves. I think we're going to be worth more in a year than we are today. If I raise $9.8 million tomorrow, I can't spend it in the next quarter. regardless of if I really tried to spend it in the next quarter. I physically couldn't do that. So why don't I raise kind of a modest amount of money to get us through the next 18 to 24 months? And if we're on schedule to raise ahead of that, or if we're growing, we can, we can spend more or not. And like, I think in general, like it was like a little bit of an analytical approach to it. And we had investors we had investors along the way where like we got a lead in index in our Series A, and a bunch of them were like, "Why don't you just expand the round and let us in? Like we'll follow
Yeah.
along, invest into them being the leader." And I was like, "Well, but we don't need that. We only need 10 million." And they're like, "Yeah, but like why wouldn't you just come on, like let us in? Like we want to put $2 million in." And like it sounds compelling. Why wouldn't you take more? But then like it's only Patrick, it's only a couple of percentage points here and there. But if you actually run this math out, like you dilute the most at the beginning, and then later on, like it makes it easier when the valuations are higher. So it's like, again, dilution math is not particularly complex, but I'd imagine that a lot of people just don't run the dilution math when they're doing it to really understand the impacts of what it's going to mean. And, again, like that was our strategy. For better, for worse, it worked out for us. Like, would it have been better if we had taken some more money on and we could be more aggressive with growth in certain areas? Maybe. Like, but also the restraints I think are probably good to make sure that we're like running lean and making sure that we're making good business decisions with the money that we have at the time. So more money is not always better unless you really know how to leverage it in a way that can give you a competitive advantage against your competitors.
Makes sense, Andrew. So let's run this home. So 6 years, sell the company to Fastly for almost $1 billion, right? Like walk through that process. Like what was your thinking behind it, right? Obviously, we talked about kind of the fundraising aspect. At what point were you like, hey, I want to sell this company?
I think there was a point when early employees would come on and they say, "Hey, what's the plan with the company?" And I think I could authentically and reasonably say like, "Look, we have competitors in the company that are public companies, so like that is a possible route for us to do. This is not a really small feature on a bigger market set. Like they're standalone companies doing what we do that are public companies, and so that's possible for us. But for me, like." We got to the point where I think when we sold, we had about 22 million in ARR. And once we passed the $10 million ARR mark and went from, 10 million to 20 million relatively fast, I think we were growing at 75% like year over year when we were at 22 million. Again, you just start doing simple math on that. Like, how much money, and at that point, like you could have $200 million in ARR and go public. Like
Yeah.
you
Take
can't
another
possibly
six
have
years.
that now, right? Yeah. But that exactly, it's like at least another 6 years, and there's all sorts
Yeah.
of execution risk in the context of that, and that's
Yep.
assuming that you can maintain a 75% growth rate for the next 6 years, like which is
Yeah.
it's a huge assumption to make. And so at some point, I was just kind of like, look, there's no way we're gonna go public, and if we are, it's another 15 years of my life essentially I'm devoting to this. Because by the way, going public isn't like a cool, I go public and then I'm out. Like, no, you don't do that. So yeah, was there a specific moment? No, but you're evaluating the stuff quarter by quarter, and you're really trying to understand like, what's our growth trajectory here or not. And there was definitely a moment when I was just kind of like, yeah, like the route for this is to sell it. And then the math also becomes a little bit clear, which is like, well, people buy things on a multiple of your revenue. And it turns out the bigger revenue you have, the smaller the multiple you get. And so there's a sweet spot somewhere in there, which is like timing really matters to try to optimize around that. And it's not that we were like, oh, we're making this decision, because what I'll tell people a lot of times is like, you can't always decide when you're going to sell the company. Like, there's a lot of factors that have to come together, which is like the buyer has to decide to buy you. But you also have to be at the right place at the right time with that buyer so that they know you're around to be able to buy you in the first place. And there's a lot of things that worked out with Fastly wanting to come and buy us, but not least of which, a massive increase in their valuation during COVID era. And they had this big spike in valuation. It turns out, guess what? Like, that's the market betting on you, expanding your TAM and doing things to grow into that valuation. And we were part of the story for them when that happened. By the way, it worked out for us, has worked out for them, and like, it was a good marriage, which isn't always the case, I think, for some of these things. But like, um, yeah. So like, I think the biggest point was that I knew that it was always possible we could build a really big company, but I also knew that at some point I was like, the growth rate is just not gonna sustain us to be able to do it. To be able to go public is kind of the short version. And then the options are die or sell the company. Because
Yeah.
there's only 3 options when you do venture stuff, right? It's go to zero, sell the company, or go public. And
Yeah.
public was gone, and so the only other 2 options for those 2, and I was like, okay, well, we need to figure out how to sell the company. And I think at that moment, Patrick, by the way, which I think is relevant to the conversation and to other founders out there, when we decided that that was the route, I actually had to go and figure out how do you actually do that?
Yeah.
Because building relationships to potentially sell the company is very different than building relationships to investors, and it's not intuitive. And again, there's not a book you read on how to do this, and so it
Yeah.
probably took a good 18 to 24 months to really understand how that process is going to work. So
I mean, Andrew, even in my journey with Amplitude selling iteratively, I think you're one of the more helpful people I chatted to at the time. One, giving me advice on just the dynamics of it, but then also two, just what does being a post-exit founder look like, and having to deal with all the uncertainty and loss of self that
it's not your
partake
company
also
anymore.
happens there.
Yep.
Yeah, it's not your baby.
Yep.
Yeah, somebody
Yep.
else's baby. Well, let's flip the table. I mean, now you're an investor, right? You founded a venture fund. What are you seeing when you talk to founders, or what are the things that you see founders struggling with when it comes to either raising capital or pitching investors? What advice would you be giving them to bring us home on this podcast?
So the advice I would give a lot. I'm not short on advice. If well, you've had to experience that, Patrick, for better or for worse. But and I'll always caveat this with just look, everybody's experience is different, and everybody's gonna. There's no cookie cutter way to start a company. There's no cookie cutter background, but I can certainly tell you what at least what we look for and what I think lends itself to successful outcomes for folks. And I think the AI age is an interesting one now, which is there's all sorts of opportunity. I totally believe this in almost every part of every industry. If you want to use AI as a means to be able to change how you approach a business and how you build software and all that stuff, great, tons of opportunity. That's not enough to justify starting a business and to have us invest in the company, right? Just kind of put it bluntly. In general, what I tell people is don't focus just on the opportunity. Focus on finding an area where you and your team have a unique advantage to being able to be successful in building the company. And that's it tends to not be hey, you have a unique angle on the technology, because technology at this point now is actually relatively easy to build, or at least the perception is such that anybody, well, okay, you have this great idea, but the idea is a tech angle. Well, somebody else will come along and do that. And so what I try to push people on is do you have some unique industry expertise or unique relationships within that industry, or unique, go-to-market expertise of an angle that's going to put you in a position to be able to be successful that other people in this industry won't have? And that all of those things have nothing to do with the actual product that you're building, and the technical differentiation for that. And so that's sort of what I would give people advice on, is just to say hey, if you're getting into something, what makes you and your team just wildly, uniquely qualified to be able to be successful in that area? And it can't just be cause AI. It can't that, because that's not enough.
Totally. Well, Andrew, really appreciate you joining us today on The First Pitch. It was great to hear the story from start to end as well. And where can people find you online, or if they're interested in Visio, where can they reach out?
I'm on LinkedIn, Andrew Peterson. I don't actually use Twitter anymore. It's been an unlock for a lot of my time and angst. And yeah, so I spent a lot of time trying to give advice and stuff on a bunch of these lessons learned on LinkedIn. But yeah, hit me up. I actually do take first meetings with people that I do not know, that are cold email outreach to me on the platform, specifically because I was there once too. So
Awesome.
love it.
Thanks,
Love
Andrew.
it.
All right. Thanks, Andrew.